You have one new message. Translating. Disney and Pixar's Hoppers is now available on Disney+.
You could say that again.
Critics are calling it Pixar's funniest movie ever and a wildly entertaining ride. Blizzard Potato. It's certified fresh and verified hot.
Now we party.
This is incredible!
Wow, I am clearing the rest of the day.
Disney and Pixar's Hoppers, now available on Disney+. Rated PG.
The last family to ever rule Imperial Russia was already plagued with instability. Then in comes an unlikely figure, a mystic wanderer from the lonely edges of Siberia who walked into the palaces of St. Petersburg and somehow made himself indispensable. Or, as many would say, to the demise of the Romanov family. This is true crime of the historical kind. You're listening to the Sideshow bonus episode of the life and assassination of Grigory Rasputin, the Romanovs' holy fool. This sideshow is connected to episodes 12 and 13 of the execution and murders of the Romanovs. If you haven't listened to those, you might want to check them out, but this can be a standalone episode. The Russian Empire in the early 1900s was teetering on a precarious edge. The old world was crumbling, being reborn into the modern world, yet the Romanovs were clinging to tradition and authority. After all, their dynasty had proudly been in power since 1613. For 300 years, rulers like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Alexandra I, the Romanovs had transformed Russia from a fractured medieval state to one of the largest empires on Earth. Russian territory stretched across Europe and Asia, controlling an enormous amount of natural resources, held a massive military, and displayed impressive cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg that were filled with the fruits of imperial wealth. The Tsar was not just a head of state. He was, by official doctrine, God's representative on Earth, and the Russian Orthodox Church bolstered his authority. But by the turn of the 20th century, the weight of imperialism was cracking. It was a dying system, though the current Romanov family seemed to either not believe that or simply refuse to adapt, and what doesn't bend can break. The social inequalities within their empire were so vast, unrest and rebellions were inevitable. While the aristocracy occupied sprawling estates and lived in opulence, they were also totally removed from the realities of most of the population, where roughly 80 to 90% were peasants. Serfdom had been legally abolished in 1861, but emancipation came at a cost. Former serfs were expected to make decades of redemption payments to the state in exchange for land that they had already worked for generations, causing strain on an already struggling demographic. With the rise of industrialization, peasants left the land they knew and flocked into cities. Their factory labor exposed them to new political ideas, organized movements, and the realization that they could be stronger if they band together. While significant changes were unfolding in the cities, the empire's frontier told a very different story. The further east you traveled from St. Petersburg or Moscow, the weaker the grip of dynastic authority seemed to become. Siberia had long been associated with exile, territory expansion, escaped serfs, indigenous communities, religious dissenters, and people living on the fringes of the Tsar's reach. To many Russians living in the imperial cities, Siberia represented something wild but barren, with just enough mystery to be intriguing. What it was agricultural frontier land, dotted with villages along rivers, between forests, and endless wetlands. Peasant communities were trying to survive in the difficult conditions of the enormous West Siberian plain, one of the flattest expanses of land on Earth. Religion in Siberian villages often blended Russian Orthodox Christianity with older folk traditions. You might find mysticism, local superstitions, and indigenous spiritual beliefs. Most Siberian peasants believed in things like miracles, visions, prophecy, healing, saints, demons, curses, and holy wanderers. You could say the spiritual world felt very much a part of everyday life, which out here was harsh. Despite the novelty it appeared to have, it was rugged, isolated, maybe even drab. So, how very unexpected would it be that someone from one of these remote villages on the fringes of the empire would somehow find themselves at the center of the Romanov dynasty? The story of Grigory Rasputin starts in western Siberia, in the village of Pokrovskoye, which is along the Tura River, in what is now the Tyumen region of Russia. His father, Yefim, was a peasant farmer and church elder who supplemented his income by driving government carts, almost like a state courier. His mother was named Anna Parshukova. She was a devoutly religious woman and mostly illiterate, like many peasants of her time. On January 21st, 1869, their son was born and christened Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. As a whole, we truly know very little about what Grigory's childhood was like, though it's clear he received little formal education. Yet there are stories of his experiences, though it is impossible to know how much of it is accurate. There were rumors that he had been wild as a boy, stealing horses, being unruly, and prone to drinking and/or fighting. Other tales cast him in a more mystical light, claiming he experienced visions as a child or displayed unusual healing abilities. One persistent story claims that around the age of 8, Rasputin nearly drowned in the Tura River, and his mother came to believe that the experience had marked him spiritually. Whether true or not, what we can say is Grigory Rasputin grew up immersed in a deeply magical religious world. Around 1886, in Grigory's late teens, he traveled to the nearby settlement of Abalak, home to one of Siberia's most important monasteries. There, he met a young woman named Praskovia. By all accounts, Praskovia was practical, patient, and deeply devoted to her family. The two married in February of 1887 and settled back in Grigory's hometown to begin a life that, at least outwardly, would have looked familiar to countless other peasant families. Together, they would go on to have several children, though only 3 survived into adulthood. They were named Dmitri, Maria, and Varvara. Even in these earlier years, people who encountered Rasputin noticed contradictions in him. He could be warm, attentive, charismatic in a way that made you feel uniquely seen and understood, while he could also be erratic, manipulative, a lush, and capable of disappearing for days or weeks at a time without explanation. This behavior seemed to spark a personal crisis, perhaps from the heavy drinking or the growing dissatisfaction with ordinary village life. Other stories claim that Rasputin experienced a vision of the Virgin Mary, calling him onto a spiritual path, or that he was trying to repent for stealing a horse. Regardless of the initial provocation, around 1897, Rasputin left his village on a pilgrimage and traveled to the St. Nicholas Monastery, a religious center in the Ural region. The monastery drew pilgrims from across Siberia, many seeking confession or healing, spiritual guidance, or simply an escape from the harshness of ordinary life. The monks there were men who had deliberately withdrawn from ordinary society in pursuit of spiritual discipline and closeness to God. It was there that Rasputin met a starets, or a spiritual elder, named Makary. In the Russian Orthodox tradition, starets were monks and holy men sought out by peasants and even czars for spiritual guidance and confession. Russia also carried a long tradition of wandering mystics and so-called holy fools, who were strange, prophetic religious figures believed by some to possess spiritual insight precisely because they rejected ordinary social rules. The exposure to intense religiosity sparked a spiritual awakening. Rasputin was fascinated by the beliefs and rituals that seemed to offer more to life than perhaps he thought was possible. It was transformative, to say the least. When he returned home, people noticed the difference almost immediately. He was intensely religious. He would pray for long stretches of time and speak earnestly about spiritual matters and fasted frequently. He even reportedly swore off alcohol for a time. Then he converted a pit under his house into a small prayer space. Word spread that he was a man touched by unusual spiritual power, and small groups began gathering there for prayer and religious discussion, with Rasputin as the source of holy answers. Soon, Rasputin would feel compelled to continue his spiritual journey on the road and essentially abandon his family to do so. He left his wife to care for their children alone, though he did come and go. From there, he drifted into being part pilgrim, part mystic, and part spiritual advisor. In the years that followed, Rasputin increasingly embraced the life of a stranik, or wandering holy man. He walked the harsh landscape, visited monasteries on pilgrimage, and preached about healing and prophecy as he continued to search for his own spiritual knowledge. Though it shouldn't be understated just how difficult walking through the rough terrain was. It was cold, and roads were rough if they existed at all. Some accounts claim he reached Mount Athos in Greece, even Jerusalem. Word began to spread that this wandering man could heal the sick, that he had visions, and he could tell you things that he would have no way of knowing. But as his reputation for holiness grew, so did the other stories. The local clergy complained about him. Rumors circulated that his prayer gatherings were not entirely spiritual in nature. Rasputin was accused of having connections to a banned sect known as the Klisti. They were a group that were seen as outlaws. They were rumored to practice rituals in crypts, like flagellation and frenzied dancing that worked them into an altered state that then allowed the body to be open to spiritual experiences in the form of religious orgies. They did see sexual relations as sinning, but they also believed that by sinning, you would then repent, and by repenting, you get closer to God. They called it sinning to drive out sin. That concept may have had a lasting impression on Rasputin, as we will see. It's the idea that living in these extremes were how you ultimately gained more power and spiritual understanding. Whether Rasputin ever truly belonged to the Klisti is still debated, but the rumors alone explain how people viewed him. By 1903, Rasputin turned west toward Kazan, the great religious city on the Volga River. There, he made an impression on the clergy and gained notoriety. From Kazan, the road kept pulling him further west, toward the heart of the empire. By the winter of 1904 to 1905, Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg, the imperial capital and the largest, most cosmopolitan city in the empire, with over 1 million people sprawling along the frozen Neva, full of grand boulevards, palaces, cathedrals, and the gilded ballrooms of the aristocracy. Rasputin's appearance in these spaces would be striking. He stood well over 6 feet tall, by most accounts somewhere around 6'3" or 6'4". He was broad-shouldered, had long dark hair with an unkempt beard, and those piercing blue-gray eyes, the kind that seemed to look straight into your soul. Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg at a time where there was a particular obsession with all things occult, especially in the upper classes. Mysticism was wildly popular. Aristocratic women would hold gatherings in their salons for seances and clairvoyant prophecies from holy men brought in from the provinces. But none were quite as enchanting as Rasputin. Once he started mingling in these circles, they were fascinated by his years of wandering, his visions, his unkempt appearance, and his ability to engage so intensely people were almost hypnotized by him. And he seemed to have a particularly magnetic effect on women. These wealthy aristocratic women seemed to abandon all sense of propriety and fawned over this man who many people said smelled like a goat. There was a different impression with men. They were more standoffish, maybe because Rasputin showed little respect for authority or social rules, and maybe resented how openly familiar he was with their wives and daughters. At the same time as Rasputin was climbing the mystical social ladder, the family at the highest rung were struggling. Tsar Nicholas II had come to power in 1894. By his own admission, he was not ready to be czar. He was gentle-natured, indecisive, and dependent on those closest to him, which was a stark contrast to his father, Tsar Alexandra III, who was a towering, physically imposing ruler who governed with rigid conservatism and absolute authority. So in steps Nicholas II to rule the largest empire on earth while being almost completely out of touch with the realities inside of it. He was viewed as weak and naive while attempting to force authoritarianism that he was not equipped to execute successfully. His wife, Empress Alexandra, was a German-born princess and granddaughter of England's Queen Victoria. She was known as Alix of Hesse. She was sincerely religious, but had converted to Russian Orthodoxy upon their marriage. It was a difficult transition from her family's traditional Lutheranism, but they actually loved each other, unlike most royal unions. They found comfort in each other, but they struggled with the responsibilities they were born into. They secluded themselves from court and seemed to not know how to navigate the expectations they didn't want to or know how to live up to. Alexandra didn't fit well in Russian culture. She spoke the language with a heavy German accent at a time when German-Russian relations were poor, and was more interested in her immediate relationships than the court-centered political networking many might expect from royals. This came off as cold and aloof, even as she was simply private and devoted to her family above all else. The Russian people would never fully accept her. And that isolation would push her further and further inward. Together, Nicholas and Alexandra had 5 children. Before Rasputin, Alexandra had already fallen under the influence of another mystic figure, a French faith healer named Monsieur Philippe. He convinced the imperial couple that he possessed miraculous spiritual gifts. Like predictions that her children would be boys, even though they weren't, at one point he even insisted that Alexandra was pregnant with the son she desperately wanted, because, of course, this was seen as her job to produce a male heir. In her desperation, she believed him. Yet doctors eventually confirmed that there had never been a pregnancy at all. The humiliation was crushing, but it didn't shake her faith in the mystical. If anything, it deepened her desperation for someone she believed truly carried divine insight. Then, in 1904, after 4 daughters, came a son, Alexei, the heir to the Romanov throne. His long-awaited birth was celebrated as the fulfillment of so many prayers, but that joy would so quickly turn to fear. It became clear that Alexei had hemophilia, a hereditary blood clotting disorder that can be traced back to Alexandra's grandmother, Queen Victoria. For a small boy, this meant that even the smallest injury could trigger an internal hemorrhage. Blood would pool with nowhere to go. Then it would be pressing against bones, organs, and skin. It was debilitating, incredibly painful, and very difficult for a child to comprehend. The family felt as though this must be kept a secret from the empire. They needed the Romanov heir to present as strong and healthy. They were constantly afraid of the young heir's condition being exposed. They did their best to conceal this and were desperate to heal him. Yet medicine in the early 1900s had no treatment for hemophilia. As a mother, Alexandra would do anything for any kind of solution that might save her son. And after the eventual death of Monsieur Philippe, she remained open to another spiritual advisor. In the elite circles of St. Petersburg, mystics and miracle workers moved through aristocratic society almost like celebrities. And no 2 women opened more doors to that world than the Montenegrin princesses Milica and Anastasia, known as the Black Crows. The sisters had married into the Romanov dynasty and built reputations as almost collectors of holy men. And they believed they knew exactly who the Tsar and Tsarina should meet. A holy man from a Siberian village named Grigory Rasputin. On November 1st of 1905, Rasputin was introduced to Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra at Peterhof Palace, one of the imperial residences near St. Petersburg. Nicholas even recorded the encounter in his diary, simply saying, "We made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigory, from Tobolsk province." They were impressed by him, so Rasputin's status rose quickly and he began receiving gifts and praise. To many in court, they saw a filthy peasant wandering through the opulent rooms of St. Petersburg society, receiving favors that they believed they were more deserving of. So, jealousy would quietly be brewing as this strange man was embraced as a friend to the royal family. But for Alexandra, it would be deeper than that. Accounts vary on the details, but in the months following their introduction, Rasputin asked to see their son. It's said that he stood at the child's bedside and prayed. He seemed to know their deepest, darkest secret and seemed to know how to cure him. Alexei had secretly been suffering from a severe internal hemorrhage. Yet, by the next morning, he had improved dramatically. The boy's parents saw this as a miracle, and soon Rasputin was free to go about the palace. Later on, Alexei would again be in bad health with an internal hemorrhage. The doctors could do nothing. So Alexandra called on Rasputin and he told her to not let the doctors touch him. And again, by the next day, Alexei seemed cured, at least temporarily. So, was it divine intervention or hypnosis calming the child and slowing his heart rate, or something more simple? Some modern researchers point to the fact that the doctors at the time regularly gave Alexei aspirin to manage his pain. Aspirin thins the blood. It is now understood to be one of the worst possible medications for a hemophiliac. Rasputin, who distrusted doctors and their medicines, insisted that the boy be left alone. Essentially, he had called for no intervention. It is entirely possible that Rasputin's greatest healing gift was simply stopping the treatment that was making the young boy worse. Whatever the true mechanism, after that, Rasputin's position was secured. So much so that when he told Alexandra that without him the boy would die, she believed him wholeheartedly. Later, Rasputin wouldn't just care for the boy. He was also acting as a healer to Alexandra, soothing her headaches and anxieties. She became pretty dependent on him. She would go on to write hundreds of letters, raw, desperate, almost romantic sounding in their devotion to Rasputin. Here are some of her own words. My beloved Father Grigory, how I long to see you again and to speak to you. My heart is so heavy. Only when I know you are praying for us does my soul find peace. Pray for me, my dear one. Pray for our little one, that God may protect him from all evil. I kiss your blessed hands and lean my head upon your shoulder. Your loving and grateful Alex. She signed it with the name only her closest family used. Though it is worth noting in these correspondences that Rasputin was barely literate. Alexandra would have known this, but she didn't care that he dictated the letters that he sent. As her devotion deepened, so did her blindness to what Rasputin did outside of the palace walls. There were reports of drunkenness, going to brothels, sleeping with married women, and even forced sexual encounters. The holy man began inviting women of all social classes to his apartment, where he would tell them to sin with him as that was the way to seek forgiveness and be closer to God. They would sit around him like followers and hang on every word as he preached. The stories of Rasputin's doings were endless. Some were almost certainly exaggerated, others were almost certainly true, and in the eyes of Russian high society that were not impressed by mysticism, these scandals could not be ignored. While Alexandra appeared to dismiss the reports as rumors made up by enemies. Even when the children's governess complained that it was inappropriate for Rasputin to be in the girls' nursery, the governess was fired. This thread running through Rasputin's life continued, a man who lived between extremes, to be loved, to be hated, holy one night, debauched the next, sacred and sinful in the same breath. And behind all of this, Russia itself was becoming increasingly unstable. Workers were striking, revolutionary groups were growing bolder, and the Duma constantly clashed with the crown. Many politically experienced Russians were demanding constitutional reform, while Nicholas continued resisting limits on his authority. In that environment, every concern surrounding Rasputin landed with a heavy weight. This was an empire already struggling with distrust, unrest, and political paralysis. In 1909, the prime minister ordered a formal investigation into Rasputin's activities, and secret police began to follow him. They logged the trips to the bathhouses, brothels, and the endless stream of female visitors to his apartment. The prime minister warned Nicholas directly. Rasputin's growing notoriety was threatening the monarchy's credibility. Nicholas likely understood that Rasputin was becoming a problem, but he continued dismissing the warnings, in part because he knew how important this man was to Alexandra. By 1914, frustration with his presence had hardened into something uglier. It was clear the royal family was not going to part with their trusted healer. Since Alexei's condition was kept a secret from even close family members, they of course didn't understand Alexandra's attachment to him. They just saw him as a dark presence poisoning the royal family from within. So for some, there was a lingering question of whether someone might simply kill him. As those thoughts festered, one of history's most pivotal moments unfolded in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were assassinated by a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist. The shots fired in Sarajevo detonated a chain reaction across Europe. Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized in Serbia's defense, and Germany mobilized against Russia. Within weeks, the continent was at war. And Russia, already strained, was suddenly fighting on a front that stretched for hundreds of miles with an army that was catastrophically underprepared. As chaos across Europe erupted, Rasputin was back in his home village when a woman approached him in the street. She plunged a knife into his abdomen, and as he fell, she reportedly shouted that she had killed the Antichrist. Rasputin would barely survive this. He underwent emergency surgery and spent weeks recuperating in Siberia. The woman was more than likely sent by one of Rasputin's enemies. She was declared insane and confined to an asylum. For those around him, his survival only deepened the sense of destiny. They believed in him more after this. A common speculation worth noting here is that with Rasputin recovering in Siberia during this pivotal moment, he was too far removed from Nicholas to advise him to not enter the war, the one thing Rasputin and his adversaries would have agreed on. And sure enough, against the advice of his advisors, Russia entered World War I in the summer of 1914. The Russian military was large but frighteningly disorganized. Troops lacked rifles, boots, and even food. And the command was chaotic. By the end of the first year, millions of Russian soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The damage was catastrophic. At home, inflation soared. Factories ground to a halt. Food shortages spread from villages to the cities. And in September of 1915, Nicholas made a decision that would essentially be his undoing. He left the capital to take personal command of the army at the front. It was meant to be a show of strength. But the notion of a czar or a king going into battle was such an outdated idea by the early 20th century, for a reason. The choice was so blundering, many believed it was Rasputin who had convinced him to do it, or better yet, set him up. Because, with Nicholas leading the troops, that left Alexandra to oversee domestic affairs back in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed to sound less German during the war, and could therefore be more influenced by Rasputin's advice. He had already been causing waves as he pushed for certain appointments. So now, to the Russian public, who already distrusted the Tsarina for her German heritage and her preference for seclusion, turned viciously on her. Cartoons showed Rasputin with his arms wrapped around the Empress, whispering into the Tsar's ear and controlling the empire like a puppet master. They accused both Rasputin and Alexandra as being spies, traitors, and German agents. This perception, true or not, solidified that Nicholas, among many other disasters in his reign, was weak and malleable. In reality, Rasputin probably was not truly running Russia completely, but his influence became proof in the eyes of the public that the monarchy had become irrational and insulated from reality. In November of 1916, Duma member Vladimir Purushkevich stood up in parliament and denounced Rasputin by name, and accusing him and Alexandra of controlling Russia like marionettes. Other members of the Duma and high aristocrats, and even Romanov relatives, all concluded the same thing. As long as Rasputin lived, the monarchy's credibility would continue to collapse. Rasputin was well aware people wanted him dead, and he wrote this to Nicholas II. If I am murdered by boyars, nobles, and if they shed my blood, their hands will remain soiled by my blood for 25 years. They will leave Russia, brothers will kill brothers, and they will kill each other and hate each other. If it was your relations who have wrought my death, then no one in your family, none of your children or relations will remain alive for more than 2 years. Was this a form of manipulation, a way to protect his value to the royal family as his enemies grew? Or was it a prophecy? The aristocracy resented the protection the Romanovs provided this dirty peasant, as they would say. They were fearful because the Russian monarchy looked like it was on the verge of implosion, unless someone finally stepped in and did something. And so, a conspiracy was formed. 5 men decided that the so-called Mad Monk had to die, and they would be the ones to do it. Prince Felix Yusupov was one of the wealthiest men in the empire. He was also married to Nicholas's niece, Princess Irina. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Nicholas's own first cousin, was charming, handsome, and considered one of the most eligible bachelors in all of Russia. He was also Felix's closest friend. Many at court suspected or assumed that they were lovers. Then there was Vladimir Purishkevich, the same Duma member who had already publicly condemned Rasputin on the floor of parliament. Dr. Lesovert, who was a military physician tasked with preparing poison, and Sergei Sukhotin, a young military officer who was brought in to help dispose of the body. They believed sincerely that killing Rasputin would be a patriotic act and would bring order back to the dynasty. The following is Felix's account. Felix had spent months carefully cultivating Rasputin's trust, attending late-night prayer sessions, visiting him at his apartment, and Rasputin grew fond of him, trusted him even. Felix told Rasputin that he would finally get to meet Princess Irina, his glamorous wife whom he had long wanted an introduction to. In reality, Irina wasn't even in the city. She was in Crimea, hundreds of miles south, with no idea what her husband was about to do. By all accounts, Rasputin was in good spirits when Felix came to pick him up. Rasputin had dressed for the evening. He even bathed. He was wearing a silk shirt embroidered with cornflowers, pale blue thread against white silk, the kind of shirt a peasant might be married in or buried in. Felix drove him to a palace that's on the Moika River in Petrograd. There, they had a basement room specially arranged. There was intricate furniture, a bearskin rug, roaring fireplace, and a cabinet stocked with wine and cakes, Rasputin's known favorites. It was made to look warm and welcoming, as if a party had just taken place. The other 4 conspirators waited in a room above the basement. To simulate the sound of a party, a gramophone was set to play upstairs. According to Felix's own account, the record was Yankee Doodle, of all things. But it was cycling through the walls over and over while Rasputin sat below drinking wine and eating cakes laced with cyanide. But nothing happened. When Rasputin asked for more, the men upstairs were in a panic. The poison wasn't working. They were in too deep now, and the deed would have to be done one way or another. So Felix went downstairs. He raised a revolver and shot Rasputin, and he collapsed. Then he went back upstairs to report to the others what he had done. But Felix was not quite settled about it, and he decided to go back downstairs to check the body, when Rasputin's eyes flashed open. He was still alive. He seized Felix by the throat. His grip was impossibly strong and whispered his name, Felix, Felix. His eyes were wild and fixed. Somehow, Rasputin managed to get to his feet. He staggered up the stairs and out into the courtyard to escape the trap that he was in. A flustered Purishkevich chased him through the snow, firing shot after shot until finally he fell. The men descended upon Rasputin and beat him, then bound him. Yet they were still afraid that this man wouldn't die. They put him in the back of a car and drove to a bridge in the freezing night. The men then had to break a hole in the ice of the river before pushing the body inside. The group returned to the palace in shock and near panic. Blood had been tracked all through the rooms. Reportedly, Felix wandered almost hysterically through the house while the others tried to organize a cover story and destroy evidence before daylight arrived. Because regardless of Rasputin's poor social reputation, murder was still illegal. The next day, Rasputin's frozen, grisly corpse was pulled from the river. The mad monk was dead. The autopsy was performed as soon as the body thawed. At the time, many believed that Rasputin had drowned beneath the ice, but more clarity would come later. Then, Rasputin's body was buried on the grounds of Tsarskoye Selo, the imperial estate, at Alexandra's personal request. The entire Romanov family was said to be distraught with grief. To Alexandra especially, it was devastating. She believed her son's protector had been taken from her. Rasputin's prophecy of how the Romanovs would not live 2 years after his death if he were killed by nobles rang loudly in her ears. She kept his comb as a relic and mourned him like a martyr. The reaction in Petrograd depended entirely on where you stood. To much of the public and the aristocracy, it was cause for celebration. Some newspapers framed it as a patriotic act. Nobles who had nothing to do with the conspiracy were quietly pleased, while Rasputin's followers were heartbroken. The secret police opened an investigation, but they didn't have to look far. But Nicholas was in a complicated bind here. To fully prosecute them would mean airing everything. Rasputin's close relationship with the Empress, their letters, her dependence on him, perhaps Alexei's condition, all of it. So instead, Nicholas chose a half measure. Felix Yusupov was exiled to a family estate. Grand Duke Dmitry was sent to the Persian front. And Pershkovich escaped any real punishment at all. Not a single person served a day in prison for the murder. As much of the aristocracy would have hoped, the death of Rasputin did not save the Romanovs. If anything, it showed how far their grasp on the empire had already unraveled. Just 2 months after the assassination of Grigory Rasputin, the revolution swept Nicholas II from power. In March of 1917, the February Revolution forced Nicholas II to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of it, was over. The Romanovs were then removed from the Alexandra Palace and placed under house arrest. Russia was now under the authority of the Provisional Government, which was a fragile, temporary administration trying to hold the collapsing empire together after the abdication. With the Romanovs in exile, soldiers exhumed the body of Rasputin. There are stories of parts of his body being taken as souvenirs. Then they burned his body in a nearby forest to prevent any possibility that his grave might become a site of veneration. What comes next is one of the most tragic moments in Russian history. On the night of July 16th into July 17th of 1918, a year and a half after Rasputin's murder, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, their son, and their companions were led into a basement room in Yekaterinburg and shot to death, just as Rasputin had warned. In the chaos that followed, with civil war, Soviet rule, decades of secrecy, the full truth of Rasputin's life and death stayed buried for years. Only later would more information come to light. The exiled Felix Yusupov began publishing his accounts from abroad and gave the world its first real look at what happened in that basement on the Moika. He published his 1927 book, Rasputin, His Malignant Influence and His Assassination, and again in his more famous later memoir, Lost Splendor, that was published in 1953. It detailed his version of the killing, which is what became the popular narrative. But parts of his story don't make sense. For one, Dr. Lazovert later admitted that the poisoning never really happened. He said that he had lost his nerve and substituted the cyanide with a harmless powder. But we also don't know exactly what his motives were in saying that. Then there's the pattern of the bullet wounds that does not support a dramatic courtyard chase. Multiple shots appear to have been fired at close range into a man that was already incapacitated. Later accounts of the autopsy suggest that there may not have been water in Rasputin's lungs at all, raising doubts about the famous story that he drowned beneath the ice. From modern investigation into the autopsy, the cause of death was almost certainly a close-range gunshot wound to the forehead. But by then, the legend of Rasputin was already bigger than the details. He'd become the inspiration behind so many books and movies that tell of a dark, mysterious villain that used supernatural power to hold undue influence. By the 1970s, Rasputin had become pop culture shorthand for something dark and irresistible, like the 1978 Boney M song called Russia's Greatest Love Machine. And for decades, a rumor circulated that Rasputin's preserved genitalia survived his death and passed through various hands before ending up on display, though the authenticity on that is widely debated. We will never know exactly what happened during the assassination, but with what we know now, Rasputin was not the sole cause of the Romanov collapse. Perhaps he was the personification of it. a peasant mystic wandering the halls of a dying empire that his life or murder couldn't save. More likely, it simply revealed that there was nothing left to salvage. This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Thank you so much for listening. I'm excited to share the next series, so stay tuned. Make sure that you're following, and if you feel so inclined, a 5-star rating is always helpful. Until next time, bye.